Welcome to today's episode of Unthinkable, a podcast about the aftermath of incidents causing catastrophic injury or death, the experts who are called to serve when these accidents occur, and lessons that we can all learn and implement in our own personal lives. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, kylebachus.com. Now here's the host of the Unthinkable podcast, Kyle Bachus.
Hey, everybody, it's Kyle Bachus. Thank you again for joining us. Have a terrific guest today. Before I get to my great guest, I just want to give a little bit of information in case this is your first time listening or watching our podcast. After more than 25 years of being a lawyer in the personal injury space, I came face to face with my own tragedy when my own mother was killed while walking across the street, hit by a commercial vehicle. And that really led me to the creation of this podcast and writing a book called Unthinkable that's become a bestseller in the legal space. And we dedicate this podcast to talking with experts in the field that deal on a day-to-day basis with catastrophic injury and wrongful death, and really give you some insight into what goes into those cases and the various roles that individuals and experts play along the way. And so, toward that end, today I have with me Alyssa Dransfield. She is an incredible victims advocate, case manager, sexual assault specialist as well. She works actually for my law firm, but I really needed to get her in front of you so that you could hear from the inside what happens when somebody reaches out to a law firm after a catastrophic injury or death, what that process looks like inside of a law firm, kind of give you the inside scoop on what this whole process is like. So thank you very much, Alyssa, for joining us today.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it. I'm so excited to have you here because I see day to day the impact that you have on people's lives, and I'm so appreciative of the work that you do. And so I want to make sure that other people get to have some insight into the inner workings of your brain and what you do to help victims. So thank you very much for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you. Happy to be here.
So let's kind of get started. First of all, can you provide just a little bit about your background and what led you to begin working with victims?
Oh, absolutely. Working with victims started really truly at a younger age. Even the kind of the course of when I went off to college, I knew that I wanted to help as many people as I could. In fact, if you were to ask my parents when they said, if you had one special power as a kid, what would it be? And it was always to fix people's pain in some capacity. So, kind of with that vision, I set off, and a lot of my past experience once I graduated college started working in the criminal side of cases. So, having defendants, but working very closely with defendants and aiding them to make sure that there were no recidivation rates going up, helping them throughout the process. I did that for about 4 years and went into the Department of Human Services then, where I was a social worker for almost 2 years, helping children, get restored with their families or moving to different families. Then to when I moved up to Denver, I started pretrial investigations. So again, went back into that criminal realm of really helping kind of keep the community safe. And then my last experience before here, I was the director of a social work program, mostly in a nursing home capacity, but still helping in that arena. And I really wanted to kind of see the full lifespan. Of course, in there, I was also working with children at a kids counseling center. And I really wanted to see how working with people at a young age to later in adulthood what that looked like and how you helped people throughout the lifespan. And of course, once I was kind of done with criminal, I wanted to learn more about the civil side of things and helping the victims in that capacity. So much of my focus before was helping kind of keep the community safe, and I wanted to have more meaningful and specific relationships with the victims versus, of course, I knew the victims were always there in the criminal side, but I wanted to be hands on with the actual victims. And that's what led me here.
Well, it's really interesting. So, what do you think it is when you say it kind of goes back to the core you, right?
Hmm.
Of wanting to be there to help relieve people's pain.
Hmm.
Where does that come from? Like, what is that? What do you think that that's about?
I think for sure people always have an intrinsic component of helping people. Empathizing and caring is not really something you can teach people. So that's always what I say, even for skill sets, is if there's not that intrinsic motivation or drive, like it's very, very hard. You could have the best tools and the best books in the world, but if somebody doesn't have empathy at their core, or they haven't been humbled or they haven't understood something to that capacity, it's very, very hard. So I think for me, I just always had that intrinsic desire. But then secondary to that, I think when anybody's grieving or they go through their own hard time, the biggest thing that they kind of learn is like, wow, like some people really, really help you, or they really help you kind of pull through that. So for me personally, it was wanting to be able to give back for the same way that I felt that maybe I wasn't alone if I was ever having a challenging time with something.
Well, I know you're an incredible, empathetic person, and I know firsthand, which you're my first podcast guest where I know firsthand
Right.
the work that you do, and so it's really incredible. So, for the people who are watching the podcast,
Mhm.
can you tell them what role you play inside a law firm
Mhm.
and um, and how you come to interact with victims through your
Yes.
current work.
Yes, I actually love this topic because I think there's such a misconception of when something comes to a law firm that it's just, the law firm focuses on just some type of recoverability and what does that look like? That's kind of how the civil side is known. But with our group and specifically what I do, it's so much more holistic. Once we get a case that comes in, of course, these individuals, whether it's a wrongful death case or a catastrophic injury, they're in such a fragile moment of their life. And I think when we intercept the case and when we first come in, of course, there's victim advocates sometimes with Colorado State Patrol or other law enforcement, and they're there initially to help these families, but we kind of intercept and help the families throughout the entirety of what becomes a very long and somewhat daunting process for these victims. So once the case, comes to me on throughout, the civil side and in a law firm, the first thing that we do is make sure that the family or the victim is stabilized, whatever that looks like, and then we meet the family where they're at, through their grief or what they're needing, and make sure that we're pretty much readily available to them at any time. I think the biggest piece that I say is grief doesn't operate between, a time clock of 9 to 5. So we intercept the case and then we are there throughout the case anytime that they need us. So it looks different depending on the cases, but sometimes that's helping with funeral arrangements or helping with the criminal proceeding process and actually physically going to these court hearings with these families. The point of this position and kind of how we integrate our roles is that our clients are never left feeling alone and they're never left having to deal with anything by themselves. We are here to help them figure out if their kid needs to move a school, if they need to sell a house, what that looks like, where to put their animals if there are animals that are still around. So it really is such a broad involvement that we have.
Yeah, it's really fascinating and really cool because you think about it, somebody that may be reaching out. We've gotten a reputation, obviously, for being, more
Mhm.
than the the regular law firm, I guess you would say. But people
Right.
are reaching out. They first reach out, and maybe they're thinking, I need to call a lawyer so that I can get financial accountability for what happened to my loved one or to myself if it's a catastrophic injury or empowering sexual assault victims. But
Mhm.
they so maybe that's why they think they're calling, but
Mhm.
really what they're actually getting is so much more than,
Yes.
hey. And so I think it's very fascinating to think about the mindset of the person when they first contact us, what they think they're calling us for
Mhm.
versus what they're actually finding in you and others
Yeah.
like you, which is you're actually their person. Like you become like their person. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah,
And
we
you can
kind of explain it
talk.
like I'm their driver helping, and as we as a team, we help make the stops all along the way on a journey that you frankly never wanted to take in the first place. But it's nice because they don't have to drive the car. We drive the car while they can actually sit passenger and we're like, "Hey, this is what you do here. You have to go to a criminal hearing. Here's what we can do." And every stop that's along the way, we help diminish any of those determinants and that impact their life or their well-being. So it's really like we're trying to put them on cruise control while we take over and help with anything that they need.
So you work in a law firm that is
Mhm.
bringing a civil case,
Yep.
but you talked about the criminal. You've a couple of times you've mentioned this, like the criminal case. Can you just explain why somebody who's calling a civil lawyer is also wrapped up in criminal stuff?
Sure. Yeah, a good example is always, when we get cases for wrongful death cases. And unfortunately, if it's a case like a drinking and driving incident, and someone or the defendant is apprehended as a result of these charges, and if whether it's our client, their spouse was killed or their child or whichever, there will be a criminal case. And some civil law firms don't, that's not really their arena, so they don't dive into it. But within our firm, we actually file, an entry of appearance into the criminal case. And this is so important because we go with the family, and our biggest role is not to supersede what's happening or not to control what's happening in the criminal matter. It's truly to support our victims throughout the process entirely because they are victims, they have rights, and we want to make sure that they're heard. And it's a very, very confusing process, and it can feel kind of isolating for the victims throughout that process because there's a common misconception of the criminal cases of what happens to a defendant. People think a defendant's always going to go to jail. They killed my loved one. This is absolutely going to happen. And sometimes that's not the case. So we want to be there at every single hearing, whether or not our clients are there, we go to make sure that they see, that the judge sees, the victim's rights are being heard, we're talking about them. We're a part of everything. And of course, we want to work in conjunction with the victim advocates and the district attorneys. Sometimes there's information that we need that we're unable to get until a criminal case is concluded. But throughout our participation, you learn so much more about the case while you're simultaneously helping the victim and the victim's family.
So you mentioned this victims' rights, and Colorado, a lot of states do have uh, what we'll call statutory or
Mhm.
um, uh, constitutionally protected victims' rights. But
Yeah.
this is something that is worth exploring a little bit, Alyssa, because I kind of going all the way back to Ronald
Mhm.
Reagan to really go back to the beginning of a victims' rights movement when he was shot, and it seemed like the person who shot, John Hinckley, I think is the guy's name, who shot President Reagan, and how President Reagan couldn't believe all the rights that the accused had, but the
Mhm.
victim didn't seem to have any. And so there's been this proliferation around the country over the last 40 years of documenting and providing statutorily or by law rights
Mhm.
for victims. So
Right.
that's really important. And we're talking about rights for victims in the criminal case, and you're talking
Mhm.
about a role that you play in asserting those rights. Can you just
Right.
talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with, inserting their rights, a good example that we bring up is, if any plea agreement or plea hearing comes, the victim's family and the victims have a right to be heard of what sentencing will look like or any pleas that are being offered. And while we have to kind of massage that in when we're talking with victims, because we have to make sure they know we're not going to go in there and we can't decide how this defendant is going to be sentenced, but we can make sure that you tell your story and that you're going to be heard, and the judge will listen. And there are ways that we have, even in cases that we've currently have, where we've been able to give the family back a little bit of control in a situation where they lost everything and had zero control. And what that looks like is sometimes if there's useful public service, a really great way that we try to involve our families is by doing, making sure that the defendant is doing useful public service at MAD, through MAD, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or a place that's more meaningful versus just, sometimes defendants can knit a blanket and that's 200 hours of useful public service. So we don't want that to happen. We want the defendant to be able to actually go somewhere and put in time. So that's very important for the family. We also assist with even the crime victim compensation application. This is a fund that our clients can use. There's up to 30,000 that our clients could get, and we just make the claim for the family. We fill out the application so that they don't have to worry about any of that paperwork.
Yeah, it's pretty empowering uh, to inform our clients that, yeah, what you said, Alyssa, which is they don't get to make the final decisions about what charges are brought or whether there's a plea or what the sentence is. But in
Mhm,
Colorado and in many other states where you have a Victims' Rights Act,
mhm,
that prosecutor is required by law to interface with the family
mhm,
through great people like you in terms of what the family believes the charges should be. And
mhm,
the prosecutor has to explain under the Victims' Rights Act why the charges that have been selected or what's being brought and why there's not more significant charges. And it's incredible to be in a position to say to the families, you might feel like an outsider in the criminal prosecution, but we're
mhm.
going to take you to the inside and we're going to be there for you. It's really
Right.
pretty incredible stuff.
Yeah.
And and then you mentioned this victims compensation
Mhm,
benefits. One of the other things that I know that I've seen you have to work on, which is, and it's a little bit, it's a little bit unique to try to explain, but there are actually times where we're concerned that the criminal charges could
mhm.
impact our ability to make a civil recovery based
Right.
upon what those charges might look like. Can you explain that interesting
Yeah.
concept?
Absolutely. And that's just another great reason why we attend these criminal hearings, because there are, and if you think of the civil side, there has to be this avenue of recoverability. And if it's somebody's insurance, if it's a motor vehicle collision resulting in death and it's someone's insurance, there are some, acts that are excluded from policies, like intentional acts. And if you go to a criminal hearing and if there's this collision and they are wanting to sentence the defendant with a murder charge, which is intentional, it could really compromise the civil side of the case. So we've really had to work with district attorneys, and we've been so lucky that there have been a lot of great district attorneys that will work with us throughout this. And what they're doing is they're making sure that, first of all, the family understands kind of our goal of there's the criminal side, but we still want to make sure there's a civil avenue of recoverability for this family. So we have to preserve kind of this route that we're going, which is excluding this intentional act kind of component. And how we do that is if we have cases where there's a potential murder charge, we work with the district attorney to make sure that the charge might not actually be murder, but it's not taking away from how the defendant is sentenced. So kind of what that would look like is vehicular homicide versus a first degree murder charge or even a second degree murder charge. But we're ensuring that while we're changing kind of the name of the charge, it's not compromising the actual time that a defendant is serving. So it's not going to make a difference for how long they go to prison. It's not going to change when they can early term or go to a parole board hearing. It's just changing the name of how they are charged. So we have an avenue of recoverability for this family. And that's just so critical. Like, imagine if you weren't involved in the criminal process and this happened, and then you try to make a civil recovery, and they're like, "Oh no, this is an intentional, charge. Sorry, it's
Boy, I
excluded."
mean, what a huge difference it makes because let's say it's a commercial driver and there's a
Mhm.
$1 million liability policy
Yeah.
and the family, if they weren't represented and weren't being helped by great people like you, they might think, wow, we're going to get the hardest, most significant charge that the prosecutor can bring, not
Hmm.
realizing they've just gotten a charge. But the criminal case isn't going to feed the kids, right? The
Right.
criminal case isn't going to replace the income from the person who's been killed for the family. That's got to
Hmm.
come from the civil case because, some people are like, well, you might get that in restitution. We'll talk about that in a moment. I mean,
Yeah.
restitution is not really an avenue where you're going to get that sort of compensation. You got to take the civil case to get that. You don't
Hmm.
want to destroy that insurance coverage. And so you're working on these solutions to say, hey, we can have the best of both worlds. We can make sure that the prison sentence is going to be significant while maintaining our access to the coverage. It's
Exactly.
really fascinating.
Yeah, it's like the making sure justice is served in all arenas, not just one silo, not just in criminal or not just in civil. We're making sure there's justice criminally that the family feels comfortable with. And then we're also making sure that there's the most significant justice we can get out of the civil side.
Yeah, it's amazing. Let's talk while we just mentioned it, restitution. I think there's a lot of people who think, well, okay, in the criminal case, I don't really need to go the civil route because in the criminal case, a prosecutor is going to make sure that I get what this word restitution is. Can you
Hmm.
just talk about your experience with restitution
Yes,
issues?
absolutely. Restitution is a very, very hard form of recovery to get, and it's not very realistic. It's not something that would make any of the victims whole. And that's also why we play such a significant role throughout this criminal process, because there are things that we can do on our side by, reserving restitution if we want to make a claim for, let's say, lost wages later on in the case, or something that we might not be able to get to on the civil side. But even then, even if it is, ordered, put on a defendant's minimus, for an amount of restitution, I mean, this some defendants are going to prison, right? And like with anything, the restitution has to come from somewhere. And if the defendant is not working, there's really not, any restitution that's going to be forthcoming. And restitution, I've never even seen amounts that have made any family whole by any means. Sometimes maybe they'll do a month of lost wages, but it's not a very fulfilling kind of recovery for our clients. So we kind of make sure it's preserved, but we don't often utilize it.
Yeah, it's a topic I have addressed in my book as well. And I think that part of the problem, like systematically, part of the problem with restitution is that, hey, the criminal justice system eventually wants these people out of the system. And
Right.
so, if you, to your point, if somebody's sitting in prison,
Hmm.
where the money has to come from someplace. If
Right.
you owe $1 million of restitution, how they're never going to be able to pay it. They're never going to get out of the criminal justice system. They're never going to be able to comply with it. So it seems like, instead judges are like, yeah, like you said, well, we'll make you pay for 1 month of wage loss for somebody who's been killed, who might be have had a natural work expectancy of 20 years. So
Right.
it just doesn't work, does it?
No, no, not at all. And it's not a it's not a, easy conversation when you have with families because they think, oh, there's this fund, I'm definitely going to get something, and that you don't really get much from it. So,
Talk about hard conversations. If we kind of pivot to another
mhm,
topic that you have to deal with on a daily basis, and that is if your loved one, you're out on the road and you're driving, or your loved one's driving, and there's a crash, and God forbid
mhm,
somebody that you love is killed or badly hurt, but you learn, hey, the other driver has insurance. The
mhm.
at fault driver has insurance. Talk about why just the fact that they have insurance might not mean very much.
In Colorado, to be street legal to drive around, you're only required to carry 2550. So that's 25,000 per person and 50,000 per accident. And I think that's probably one of the most disheartening conversations you can have with a victim who's either catastrophically injured or who have lost their loved one, because sometimes people see billboards or commercials and they're like, "Oh my god, this act is so egregious, it's so horrible. It is absolutely worth, millions." I keep seeing these billboards about it. It absolutely is worth this, and you have to have a conversation of, there's no fund really that's out there for these types of accidents. So you have to look at what kind of insurance does a defendant have who caused this. And if they only have, if you look at the accident as a whole, or they only have this 25 state minimum policy and no assets, that's truly the only avenue of recoverability sometimes. Of course, we investigate all areas that could be an avenue, but if you're just kind of with this $25,000 dollar policy, it's quite challenging, for a family, because say if, it's their husband who was the primary caregiver, or if he was the primary one who came and had all of the income for the family, it can be, I mean, they're never going to be restored. So not only are they missing their person the rest of their life, their life is financially in shambles. So sometimes we do have to have those conversations. But when we do, it's kind of just making sure that we've overturned every single rock to see what could be available for the family.
So this idea that just because you have insurance, uh, everything is going to be taken care of. That's just not true, is it? I mean,
Correct.
it's how much insurance did the person that hurt you
Right.
buy, right?
Right.
And if they didn't buy enough, like you said, money has to come from someplace.
Mm-hmm.
First stop is let's see what insurance, and then you mentioned assets.
Right.
Um, can you just talk a little bit about what you mean by the assets and how that works with the insurance problem?
Yes, absolutely. So if, for our cases, if, we get back, confirmation from the insurance that it's a state minimum policy, or sometimes even no insurance at all, we are not just, it's not case closed, or all right, that's what we have. We then kind of go beyond that and say, well, did this individual own a house? Do they have assets? Is this an avenue of recoverability? Did somebody else own the car? Are there other policies that we can look into? Was the defendant who caused this accident, was he allowed to be driving this vehicle that he was operating? There's so many tiers that we then have to look into to really make certain that there's no other avenues for this family to make any type of recovery. Even for properties, sometimes we can intervene and get in on a case before a property sells. And that can be an avenue of recoverability for the family. But that's really, along when we're doing all of our holistic and making sure the family is stable and okay, we're thoroughly investigating every single component of what might make this family whole.
And there are some circumstances where you have, let's say, a drunk driver. Maybe they're a
Hmm.
habitual. Maybe they can't even get insurance, and now they've hurt or killed somebody, and they
Hmm.
have no insurance. And we do an asset check, and the drunk driver is about to go to jail for the next 10 years, doesn't own any property and doesn't have any assets. That's a horrible situation to have to explain to a
Right.
family, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's very, very, very hard because it's, such an act that turned a family's world completely upside down. But our first thing with any drinking and driving accident is where was this defendant coming from? And it's so critical for us because we're trying to find out if they were leaving an establishment that overserved them, if they where they got the alcohol from. So it's a whole investigation that could be another avenue of recoverability that we
Well,
have
man,
to.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. So
Mhm.
there are times with the drunk drivers where maybe the drunk driver doesn't have any insurance or any
Right,
assets, but we can identify a bar or a liquor licensed authority that served a drunk driver
right,
before they got in their car, and we can then hold them that entity liable.
right.
That's something that's really important to be looked into.
Yes. Yeah, that's probably the biggest thing, and where even kind of back to the criminal side of the case, where we have to try to work with the district attorneys or even the officers of trying to say, where was the defendant at, and if we can just ask him, where did he come from, where was he at before this? Because if we want to investigate this and find this avenue, we know, in this office we have 1 year to make a claim if this establishment exists, if this person went to a bar and they were intoxicated, being served, left, and then the collision happened. But, we really have to hit the ground running because 1 year is a short amount of time. And of course, we're again barred from some information on the criminal side. So it's a lot of like networking with just communities of people to learn this information so we can thoroughly investigate all areas that could potentially, a family can make a recovery on.
Boy, and one of the things that we're really trying to work with law enforcement on is what you just said, which is especially with the body cam now, where
Right, yeah.
officers are walking up and they're all have live body cam, and so if they could just ask the question, you
Right.
know, of the drunk driver and get it on that body cam. Where
Mhm.
did you just come from? Where were you drinking?
Right.
And getting that answer is so important to us because, like you also said, here in Colorado, and every state's different, but in Colorado, we have 1 year to
Mhm.
bring a liquor liability case. And so, man, we got to get that information as quickly
Mhm.
as we can. Uh,
Yes.
and that's something that I know you go to work on immediately. I've seen
Yeah.
it myself.
Mhm.
Somebody you do an intake of a case, and we're like, okay, now how can we find out where the person is drinking? And you jump all over that.
Right. Yes, and it just starts with really listening to the story, and that's you'll learn the most from going to these initial hearings of figuring out, where sometimes they share it, and we get lucky, with some district attorney's office who are willing to give us as much information as they can. But yes, we only have 1 year, and it's so huge. I mean, think about it. If a family is suffering from a crime and this individual has no assets or no insurance and this is the only thing that we are holding on to, it's so vital that just that one question of where were you at, it's so vital to have that because once we know we can start all of the work that we need to do.
And once you identify a location, like a bar or
Hmm.
a restaurant, a bar, d- tell the audience what you do next to preserve and secure the information from that bar and why it's so important to know sooner rather than later.
Yes. So right away, once we learn of the bar, we send out our investigators to the location, and we actually will have them go. The investigators will go to the location. We have them preserve any surveillance. That's so important because sometimes surveillance systems, they might be good for 30 days, and if you go a month later, they're not going to have any type of video or surveillance footage. We have them. Look at all areas of where there might be any cameras within the bar. We then write very detailed, what's called, preservation letters that we send to these entities requesting, preserve all of your receipts, preserve all of your video footage. Let us know who was with this defendant, who was in the bar all of the times, because we know in the back of our mind we have to prove that they were served when they were knowingly intoxicated. So it's when you think of that, like, well, how do I do that? Okay, well, videos. Are they stumbling around? What do they look like? The receipts, how many shots did they order? What was the time that they ordered it in? Um, who was around them? Were they slurring their words? Were they impaired? Were they staggering? There's so many components that go in. And that's why it's so crucial we have it on the front end, because if we get information later and that video is already taped over, or they don't have the video footage anymore, that's kind of losing out on one component that really helps what we need to prove.
Wow, yeah, fascinating. And in those cases where, let's say, somebody just drank at home or drank at a party, one of the limitations in Colorado is there is no what's called social host liability, meaning
Mhm.
if you're just at a private house or drinking on your own, uh, you bought at a grocery store and you weren't drunk when you bought it, there's nothing that can be done. So the liquor liability piece of it is really important to check off our list of were they drinking at a place that basically has a license to sell or serve alcohol, because then there's that um, when you get that privilege as a bar to make money selling alcohol, you also have the responsibility not to overserve, and that gives us an avenue of recoverability. Now there are all kinds of other cases that where there isn't drinking, where somebody is at fault, catastrophic injury or death occurs, and there's no or very little insurance on the part of the person who caused the crash, and there's no assets, let's say. There's another insurance
Mhm.
that we love, right? That's called uninsured, underinsured
Mhm.
motorist coverage. Can you tell those watching what that is and why it's so important to their lives?
Yes. Yes, UIM, so underinsured or uninsured motorist coverage is so important. It really is the only coverage that follows you wherever you go. But it also is not an insurance that you're required to have. So sometimes when you're getting your insurance, the agents really aren't telling you, "Hey, you've got to have, UIM insurance." It's something that is so critical to you. They're not having these conversations. So sometimes our clients will have it, or sometimes they just didn't want to pay more money and they opt out of this insurance. Why it's so critical is not only does it follow you wherever you go, if you're on a bicycle or if you're a passenger or with your friend, you can utilize this insurance if there's no insurance, if there's underinsured insurance. And that is why you pay for that insurance. So it's a coverage that you have, you can utilize it. But if it's a insurance that is opted out of from our clients, we ask then for a signed rejection form to make sure that they actually rejected this insurance. If the insurance doesn't present this form, you can actually still collect this benefit, and it does not. Sometimes there's a misconception of like, I don't want to give my insurance information. This was not my fault. I don't want my insurance to increase. If you are not at fault for this collision and if there's no insurance or a little amount of insurance, you can make a claim and get this recovery, and it's not going to impact your insurance at all. So it's a very great insurance to have.
Man, one of the things that bothers me sometimes about the way that automobile insurance is marketed to the general public. I mean,
Hmm.
almost every automobile insurance commercial that you see talks
Hmm.
about what? Saving you money, saving you
Right.
money, saving. You can call
Hmm.
us. I'm going to save you 10% or less, 10% or more, whatever. Like,
Yeah.
it's about saving money. And I get it. I understand
Mhm.
car insurance can be expensive, but wouldn't it be better to be told that, you know, we're going to save you money where we can, but we're going to make sure that if God forbid something terrible happened to somebody in your family, that you're going to have the kind of insurance and enough insurance to be sure that things are going to be taken care of. I mean, I
Mhm.
feel like there's a whole different marketing product scheme that could be done out there, because what we know is that a lot of people, the law requires that they offer you this uninsured motorist coverage, but we see way too many times where people have checked it off and
Yes.
decided not to buy it. And
Right.
it is incredible because
Mhm.
it stacks on top of whatever insurance the at-fault driver may have, and that may mean in some cases it stacks on top of $0, right? If the at-fault
Mhm.
doesn't have any, then you have this safety net coverage. If the at-fault driver has 100,000 of coverage, it
Right.
stacks on top and provides you what you need. And it
Yeah.
really, I know when you look at your own policies, for those in the audience, when you look at it, the premium for this stuff is not very much. We've
No.
had a lot of people who have been so grateful that they were with an agent or had a family member who told them buy uninsured motorist coverage, and it really saved their family situation. And there's other
Mhm.
situations where we're like, man, I just wish you had purchased it. It's
Right.
really
Oh, yeah, I was even one of those people, if you remember, I was, in college, I'm like, "I don't know what uninsured motorist is," so never signed up for it, and then I remember I just gave my policy to you to look at, like, and you asked me, like, "Well, why don't you have this?" And then truly, like, 2 months later, somebody rear-ended me, totaling my vehicle. I didn't and luckily I switched my
yes,
insurance because the person who hit me was underinsured, but if I would have not changed my insurance, I didn't have comprehensive or collision or UIM insurance. And that's what saved even me myself was moving it and my own insurance, my own uninsured motorist kicked in. So it's just crazy when you think about it and it should be talked a lot more about. But, we've even had clients really, really get increase their insurance afterwards.
yeah. Well, and it's real easy if you are a listener and you pull out your what's called your policy declarations page, which is
Hmm.
the summary page of the coverages, and it shows the premiums that you paid for each coverage. And you look, it'll either say uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage, or sometimes it just has the letter U and the letter M, and you can look and see whether you have it, or it might say UM or uninsured motorist, and it might say rejected, right?
Hmm.
Instead of giving you a coverage amount. If that's the case, call your agent today and get yourself some uninsured motorist coverage.
Yeah.
Nobody ever thinks that they're going to be involved in a crash or a collision or ever need it. But I promise you, it happens, and you'll want to have it in the event that you need it. So, Alyssa, let's switch and talk um, about a topic that sometimes is difficult. I mean,
Hmm.
you deal on the daily
Hmm.
with really traumatizing
Hmm.
cases
Yeah.
and situations. And I've asked you, I mean,
Mhm.
there are some people who, you know, don't want to look at any of the photos or videos of some of these events that are recorded. And there's others that kind of, we have to a little bit to be able to best represent the clients. How do you deal with the traumatizing cases that you face every day?
Right. No, that's a great question because it is something, that comes up with any victim, advocate in this type of capacity or with the work, that we do. And I think for me personally is really, I'm always in tune with my why, of why am I doing this in the first place? It was a very intentional kind of career path. It's not something that I just stumbled into and was like, well, I think I can help. My why is just kind of going back to that earlier statement of like making anything better to make someone else's pain better. And I kind of have to, I guess I have the emotional intelligence enough to realize like, while this is really sometimes challenging to see, or for sure there are heavy weeks where we get an influx of cases, where there's many wrongful death cases or even amputations or things like that. Um, it's, it's their trauma and their pain, and my job, kind of how I see it, is as I'm here to kind of help it make just a little bit better. I know that I'm not ever going to make it full circle better, but sometimes, even our clients, just if they can have someone to talk to, and just to listen, is really kind of the why in helping it. So I think, on the days where it might be too hard or it's, horribly, sad stories at times, it's just, how can I help them in the now? Because this is where we are, this is where they're here. And how can I just help them, see the other day through? So I think that's just for me always in the back of my mind.
And when you're doing this work, what do you find most gratifying about it for somebody else who might be thinking, might be listening and saying, "Boy, that's an interesting career path. That might be something I'm
Mhm.
interested in." What would you say you find the greatest level of gratification in?
Gosh, it's so like rewarding when you know that, and it's not even, from just a financial standpoint. It's great when a family can get recovery, but it's so much more when a family can say like, "Hey, I didn't even know how to write a job application, and you helped me do this, and I got a job, and I had no idea what I was doing, and thank you." Because that's kind of the point, right? Like we're building bridges when their whole world was turned upside down, and you're kind of helping them adapt to a completely new normal. And sometimes, the way I look at it is like, we really, as victim advocates or any type of this work, like, we are a part of the bridge of them crossing over and getting to that point. And if nobody was there helping them, then it's, who knows to say, like, where would they be, stuck at throughout this hard process?
Can you, I think you alluded to some of the work that you have done. Can you
Hmm.
just briefly tell us the story about the young man who's was, I guess, in his early 20s and had
Hmm.
younger brothers and sisters. His mom's killed, and what you did for him in terms of helping him get on his feet to help.
Absolutely.
How he
Yeah.
becomes the grown up in the family. Can you talk
Yes,
about
it
that?
was a sad case. This gentleman's world was turned upside down, and what he thought, was going into a young adulthood and enjoying things, and deciding if he wanted to go to school or what kind of career. All of that shifted when his mom was suddenly killed, and he kind of had to grow up overnight, and be put in this position. As he was the proper claimant for this case, he was like, I don't even know where to start or what to do. So we helped make sure that he, came back to Colorado, making sure like airfares, where he was getting there, where he needed to be just to kind of handle all of his mom's things. Going through and looking, his mom had a lot of animals, like quite a few. So too much for him and his other brother to kind of care for. So where are these animals going to go to? Where do I start here? And starting, moving from one state to the next, especially Colorado, if you've never been here, which this individual never had, you have no ties into a community. You have no job, like you don't know where to start, So there were some weekends where I helped him build a resume. We found what his skills were, and practice kind of what that would look like in the interviewing. And he ended up getting a job. And even to this day, 2 years later, he's a supervisor at this job. And like that to me is so huge of a success of just making it a little bit better so somebody could kind of have, a new normal, like I said. So
Yeah,
yeah, it was.
it's really an amazing story. Here's somebody who contacted a law firm because his mom had been killed to find out what he could do to stabilize his family financially. And not only are you able to work with him to successfully, um, you know, help get that financial recovery in the long run, man, you get the kid a job, and he's been there for more than 2 years, and he's stable here, and that's the kind of story that I know has got to just warm your own heart and say, man, this is why I do this.
Absolutely. It's really you can get lost in the weeds or the anguish of it all. But it's just those are the things that you hold on to of, because it's, unfortunately it's the reality for everyone who's left behind after these things happen. So it's, how do I make that their new normal look better? What is it that I could do? And oftentimes it's the smallest things that go the distance with these victims. So it's just always in the forefront of my mind.
We're getting towards the end of our session today. I do want to ask you though about um, you know what we have a period of time where you're working on a case, and
Mhm.
the criminal case ends at some point and the civil case ends at some point, but the loss goes on forever.
Hmm.
And what life looks like after a case settles and what role you play in helping to establish that.
Right. And that's always, it can be different, of course, for different cases, but once, and hopefully there's financial recoveries, but sometimes, if there is, that's we even, make sure that it goes into, helping them buy another house, or if a family wants to move, or if they want to go overseas or move to different states, what that looks like. We even make sure that if there is financial recoveries, we sit on phone calls and work with the families to make sure, are they wanting to put their money in certain trust accounts and what that looks like. And apart from just financial stability, we just check in on a lot of the emotional components of seeing what they need and carrying on with that relationship, which many of them still do, even after our case is kind of concluded on the civil side. But it really kind of ends when you think about that whole holistic component of, you're kind of, the cases might be in complete disarray because their life is in shambles in the beginning. And it kind of goes full circle of, this financial recovery, but so much more of where are they at mentally and spiritually by the end of this? Where are they at, for housing? How are their finances being protected? What's going on with their family? And it truly just comes full circle. And sometimes the work doesn't even end after there's a recovery.
Yeah, and then there's this kind of legacy thing where I know after my mom was killed, I mean, my book is a tangible product of that, right? Wanting
Mhm.
something good to come out of something
Yes.
so horrible. And I don't know why that is part of the human experience, but gosh, it sure is. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
I think it's part of you've lost control over an entire aspect of your life, right? You've
Hmm.
lost control over having the ability to save somebody from being killed, but you moving forward can do things in their name or for them. And I know
Hmm.
you've played a big role in some of the legacies that have been created along the way.
Oh, absolutely. I think, yeah, legacies is huge to families, even a case, where a gentleman, loved a certain graffiti artist and his own art, and the family, in his honor and his passing had made stickers, kind of this of this artwork that they kind of gave to all the friends, they gave to us, and even 3 years, later now, I still bring these stickers kind of with me, and even some of my own friends and, my coworkers, and any place that we travel, there's my friend at the Eiffel Tower with this sticker, me, and Mexico at this, and we send it to the family, and there's a map, of everywhere where this individual has kind of traveled with people.
Yeah.
And like I said, that's 3 years later, and it's something I still do to this day because it's just honoring his presence and it's not forgotten. And it's very cool when you see the map of where he's been.
Yeah, it's awesome. You did just some incredible work, and the world's a better place for having you in it
Yeah.
and you serving these families. It really is. We are winding down here.
Yep.
I would like to just ask, based upon as we close out here, based upon everything that you see on a day to day basis,
Mhm.
whether there's a life hack or something important that you would say, hey guys, if you do this or don't do this, what would that be?
Oh gosh, the biggest thing, I mean, we already talked about it, but that always comes to my mind is look at your insurance and get that UIM or coverage and that uninsured. It really just takes a few seconds, and I'm telling you guys, it will really save you in circumstances that you've never thought you would have to be in. And I'm one of them. I changed mine and it happened to me. So if you take anything, is just look at the coverage and make sure you have it.
Well, thank you, Alyssa, and
Yes.
thank you for your time today. I know how busy you are. I really, really appreciate you being here, and thank you for everybody
Yes.
for listening today. Hope you have learned something that is valuable. I'm sure you have. I'm sure you've learned a lot today, and I hope that we've helped you and will help you navigate your future and your life. Stay safe out
Mhm.
there. Stay smart, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very, very much, Alyssa.
Yes, thank you. Bye, everybody.
You've been tuning into the Unthinkable podcast with your host, Kyle Bachus. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, kylebachus.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.